Ako din naman maganitog ubang kwet ni go quick kibenas kaya zo bitang minuan de jin kas sure do dem kagiwa de soni ga mimi no je miteo chicken na mo. Hey, my relatives, my name is Kinew. Wap is short for my real name Wabanakwit, which means white cloud. I'm a member of the Lynx clan, and I grew up in a community called Raven's Nest Portage in northwestern Ontario on Lake Woods. And I'm a member of the Middaven, and I'm very happy to be here today. I'm going to talk to you guys about 4 things, and I have them written on my iPhone. So I'm going to put that there. So I'm not checking text messages if I'm referring to them. Okay. Just referring back to my guide. So the 4 things I'm going to talk to you about is 1, myself, 2, myself, 3, no. 1, myself, 2, I'm going to talk a bit about what I call the self-fulfilling prophecy, and then Barack Obama, and then I'm going to bring it on home. So the first thing I wanted to say on the issue of the myth that Aboriginal people don't vote is that it's not true. I vote. I've already voted in the provincial election. In the past federal, civic, previous provincial and federal elections, I have voted. And not only that, I make it a point to bring my 2 young children with me to the polling station so that they see that participating in democracy is 1, important, 2, easy, and 3, most of all, incredibly boring. No. But it's important for me to teach my kids how to participate in democracy because we can make generalizations and we can even analyze and do research on entire populations, and all those things are, I guess, important and can provide insight. But fundamentally, the only thing that we have control over is ourselves and our own personal action. So myself, I fully believe in being an engaged and active citizen, and the only way that I can spread that gospel is to live and walk that myself, and to try and, you know, encourage those around me to do that. So that's why I drag my kids with me to the polling station, and that's why there's 2 little boys running around the polling station when I'm casting my ballot. So that's one. As far as the self-fulfilling prophecy goes, I guess it comes out of a discussion that I had with Paul Chartrand. He was one of the commissioners on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And we were discussing a couple of years back, as we were coming up to the 20th anniversary of the crisis at Oka, what some of the root causes were. And he had a very cogent analysis of why there are situations where direct action, as activists like to call it, take place. And basically it is that because the Aboriginal population is sparse and it's difficult to, even in the regions where Aboriginal people are, you know, I guess living in, well, where they do make up a high percentage of the population in a given riding or constituency, it's difficult to marshal their support into voting in a given block or getting them to vote uniformly. And for a few other related reasons, basically he was saying that you don't see Aboriginal people exerting a tremendous amount of influence over mainstream Canadian politics. And because of that, there's a feeling in the community that they're not listened to, well, I guess I should say we're not listened to and we're not heard from. And because of that, then things like Oka and related things become a necessity because it's the only way that you do get heard. And I think that that's very accurate and it's very true. But I think that in the 20 years since Oka, it's had a bit of the effect of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy in that in the protests and movements since Oka, a lot of young Aboriginal people have grown up in their aftermath and maybe, you know, subconsciously internalized their witnessing those things and formed an attitude that says, well, I don't need to vote because I will exert my political influence at the protest or at the blockade or what have you. So that's the one side of it. The second, I guess, the side of the self-fulfilling prophecy that I sort of wanted to discuss was a lot of times in discussions in the social sciences around Aboriginal people, we confuse the causes with them being Aboriginal when in fact the causes are poverty. Okay? So like in this neighborhood, for example, we probably make a lot of generalizations about, and I don't mean this neighborhood as in like Selkirk, I mean provincially, this Point Douglas constituency. So like we might say a lot of things around, okay, Aboriginal people don't like to vote because of reason X, reason Y, reason Z. But it's not so much in this area to do with the fact that they're Aboriginal. It has to do with the fact that it's a low-income neighborhood. And then across North America, and generally speaking across the world, you could look at low-income populations and find similar sort of expressions of, I guess, lack of political will or political import and things like that. So I think that's another important thing to be conscientious of. And I think Fiona alluded to, like, you know, in her talk, talking about how if you remove some of those effects, you would find that Aboriginal people do in fact vote in large numbers, or at least comparable to the rest of the Canadian population. So those are two things that I wanted to discuss. Growing up, like I always formed my own, I guess, view of Canadian society and North American politics in general in a somewhat skeptical sort of way, and I don't know how to say it in a more palatable way than to say it like this. Like I basically thought that any sort of Aboriginal or non-white person who was going to be successful in mainstream politics was basically going to be a sellout or a token as I was growing up, right? And that's sort of the attitude that I had until 2007, 2008, when I saw Barack Obama come onto the scene in the American, I guess, presidential campaign. And I was lucky enough to get to meet him in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, when he was campaigning in the Democratic primary against Hillary Clinton. And for me, it was a watershed moment. It was a very life-changing experience because, like I said, up to that point, I had a very dismal view of what the importance of like a Native person or a non-white person could be in the mainstream political process. But then when I met him, I was taken aback at, you know, how powerful his presence was, for one thing. But more important than the rock star effect, what I saw was a very skilled retail politician and a very tactical, ambitious person. From the second that he walked into the room, it was very apparent that, you know, here's a guy who's been working a long time towards his goal of becoming president of the United States of America, right? It didn't happen by accident. So from a very young age, this guy decided that. He put the skills together, he put the tools together, and methodically set about to reach his goal, right? And once I saw that, and I saw the way that he worked the room, like, I was in there with a meeting with the tribal chairman and their assistants for the tribes in South Dakota. So these are all people who are very, like, skeptical of mainstream politicians because they've been promised things, and those promises have been broken for well over 150, 200 years, right? So anytime they hear promises for politicians, they're skeptical. And yet, you know, young Barack Obama walks into the room, waves his hand, and he says, it's all about education, it's all about healthcare, it's all about recognizing you guys as sovereign nations. And then from that point forward, they were all eating out the palm of his hand. And once I saw that, I realized, like, this guy is like a fantastic, you know, retail politician. And then at that point, I realized too, like, this guy's going to win the general election, not just the primary. He's going to win the general election in 2008. And why? It's not because of some sort of, you know, well, there's a lot of factors at play, I guess, to be totally honest. But the biggest reason is because he's better at playing the political game than anybody else out there, you know, regardless of what their race or nationality is. And once I realized that that could happen in the States, then my whole thinking about Canada could change. And it was basically that from that point on, I started thinking, well, if any person in Canada were to have the same skill set, were to have the same ambition, the same educational opportunities, then they too could, you know, reach the highest elected offices in Canada. And as soon as I realized that, I thought, like, holy cow, this is a must. This is something that we gotta encourage, and we gotta one, spread education to all corners of the country so that all children in Canada have the opportunities to, you know, fulfill their career destinies. And two, we have to encourage participation in democracy to all corners of Canada, especially the First Nations and the Inuit communities. And I think it's, like, just to digress a little bit, like, I think it's really irresponsible for the scholars who argue that voting is in some way infringing on your Indigenous sovereignty. Like, I think that's ridiculous. One, it's ironic that these academics choose to advance their personal lives and careers in Western academia, and that doesn't infringe on their indigenous sovereignty in any way. And then yet at the same time, like voting, so this little trivial act is going to somehow like threaten your nationhood as a an Iroquois or a Anishinaabe person, what have you. So anyway, that's just my view on that subject. But it's a debate that has two worthwhile points of view. One is right, which is my point of view, and one is wrong. But anyway, the whole point that I'm trying to get to there is the reason that there has not been a tremendous interest, I think, in Canada is because it takes time and it takes a star candidate to mobilize the Aboriginal voters in Canada. You do see it in certain localized elections here in Canada. Like, I mean, the progressive conservative, or not progressive, the federal conservative candidate from Labrador, who's now a cabinet minister, like he worked his constituents really hard. He worked really hard at the advanced polling, and he got an amazingly high turnout in mainly Aboriginal ridings. So it does happen if you have candidates who inspire the voters to come out. I think to see it happen on a national level in Canada would take a star national Aboriginal candidate. If that were to happen, then yeah, there'd be huge numbers of voters coming out from the different communities. Whether or not that needs to happen, I don't know. Like personally, I would like to see it happen. So anyway, the fourth point that I want to talk about was just again about being an active citizen and engaging in democracy. Like myself, I'm a nerd. I'm a bit of a keener. My friends always tease me like, "Oh, what are you going to do? Write a letter?" Like when you get mad. Like, "Oh, what are you going to do? Write a letter?" But just a little anecdote. Like I do write letters. This one time, I was really upset that Todd Bertuzzi couldn't play hockey for Team Canada at the 2006 Olympics in Turin, Italy. I was really mad because everybody was saying, "Oh, he's a criminal. He's got a criminal record. He shouldn't represent Canada." So I wrote a letter to the editor of the Winnipeg Free Press saying, if he is the best hockey player available, and he's apologized and is trying to make amends, then give him a second chance. Why not? People deserve a shot at redemption. So the Winnipeg Free Press published that article on my birthday, December 31st, 2005, last day of 2005. And then somebody at the CBC read it in the newspaper and called me up. They looked me up on the phone. They called me up at home. They said, "Hey, are you Wab?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then the one that wrote the thing for the Free Press was like, "Yeah." And they said, "Why don't you come in and turn that into a rant for the radio?" I said, "Okay." So I did. And while I was there, I ranted some more. I sat in on some story meetings, and then they said, "Well, come in for a week and we'll train you to be a freelancer." And then after that week was up, they said, "Well, come in and you can work for us for a week." And then after that was up, they said, "Do you have any ideas for a radio show?" And I said, "Yeah." And then I got a radio show. And then like 6 years later, I'm a television journalist at the CBC. I've been working there ever since. So it just goes to show, like that's my personal experience with how being an active citizen can reward reward yourself. I forgot how I started that sentence. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is this: being an active citizen is important and it pays dividends, regardless of where you come from. And it's sorely needed in the Aboriginal community for there to be role models to set that example. And the reason why there are not role models that are doing that are, great and varied. There are tons of reasons. But at the end of the day, none of the reasons or excuses are good enough to prevent a change from taking place. Like, you can understand why Aboriginal people don't vote, But the most important thing that I would say is that it's important today for Aboriginal people to get out and vote, So I'm doing my part on a personal level to inspire my children and those people around me. Probably nobody's going to listen to me. Maybe my kids will vote when they grow up. So I'll have influenced 2 people in like 16 years. But at least that's a start. And I would encourage all of you to have these discussions with people that and badger those amongst your friends and colleagues who don't vote and remind them to go vote, because That's basically the only way you're going to have influence over the political process. Maybe somebody will watch the video at home on YouTube, and they'll go vote, and then we'll have even more power exerted. So anyway, so that's basically it. Go out, be a good citizen, be active, and then I guess the only other thing I wanted to say is that even if you do see yourself as a citizen of a sovereign indigenous nation, why give up the opportunity to exert influence on the other guy's political system? Why?